This happened 4 months after the birth of our beautiful baby girl. Our little girl was the sweetest, most gentle little newborn any new parent could have asked for. We named our little one after the month she was born in, May. May was born on a rainy night. I was the only one in labor on the entire floor that night. Like any new mother, I was exhausted after hours of labor. All I wanted to do was rest. My husband Matt looked after our little one while I rested a bit, but he eventually fell asleep too. I was laying in my bed watching my new family sleep peacefully when I felt a sudden urge to use the restroom. I called for my nurse, asking her to help me get up and walk over to the bathroom. After a few minutes, the nurse came in. I hushed her as she began speaking. I pointed to Matt, who was passed out on the sofa. The nurse and I quietly exited and began walking to the bathroom. As we were making our way back to my bed, another nurse came in carrying a small blanket. She walked in and began looking around. When my nurse asked her who she was looking for, her coworker looked confused. She began explaining to us as she was passing over to the nurse station. She walked past her room and saw a little girl with long black hair standing on her tiptoes, looking at her newborn baby girl. The nurse mentioned that the little girl was wearing a dress and assumed she might need a blanket since the room is chilly. I looked at my nurse confused and a little worried that someone else's kid could just walk into my room and look at my newborn without anybody but the nurse noticing. I quickly told her that May was my firstborn and that we weren't expecting any visitors. I asked if perhaps the little girl had gotten separated from her parents' room. However, my nurse was quick to mention that there were no other families at the moment with children on the floor. A few months after that, Matt and I moved into our new home. We were immediately welcomed by everyone, and we liked our new neighborhood. As we were unpacking and setting up May's room, I pulled out some baby monitors that we were planning on using now that May would be sleeping on her own. Matt and I were testing the baby monitors for a while. He was upstairs in May's room and I was downstairs in the kitchen. After a few successful tries, I began making dinner, leaving my baby monitor on the counter. I was cutting vegetables when I began to hear static on the monitor. Thinking it was Matt probably messing with it upstairs, I ignored it and turned it off. I walked over to the fridge when I heard a very faint voice. I walked over to the counter and picked up the monitor, pressing firmly against my ear. A very faint but identifiable noise was coming from the static. I realized right away it sounded like a young child's laughing. I turned around looking at May. She lay quietly on her swing, sleeping soundly. I turned back to the monitor, trying to make out the noise again, when suddenly it stopped. The lights on the monitor went down and stayed off. Matt came in the moment through the back door, carrying some tools from the shed. I asked him if he had taken the baby monitor with him outside. He looked at me and laughed at my strange question. He replied back saying that he had left the baby monitor upstairs a while ago. I began telling him what I had just heard. He shrugged it off and explained that it was most likely interference from another family's monitor. A few days after that, I decided to take May to the park. We left home and began making our way down the street when my next door neighbor stopped us. My next door neighbor was a sweet old lady. She began talking to May and asked me how everything was going. She was very good around May, and she held her excitedly and began telling me how nice it was to have a baby in the neighborhood. I asked her if there are any other children in the neighborhood, to which she quickly replied, no. Oh sweetheart, there haven't been any children here in a long time, but it's sure nice to finally have one around. She continued playing with May, as I began remembering the baby monitor static. I assumed that the monitor probably didn't work anymore, and told myself to remember later to tell Matt that we needed a new one, when she began talking again. She mentioned that she was always willing to babysit, in case Matt and I ever needed it. I thanked her for her offer and began pushing May's stroller when she suddenly turned towards me and replied, "Of course, dear. I can understand if you need a break." This little one has a mouth, doesn't she? I heard her cries all last night. I couldn't help but to think, what strong lungs she has. I looked at her confused and began explaining that May always slept through the night and cried very little. May certainly didn't cry loud or long enough for someone next door to hear. She nodded, then winked at me. She most likely thought that I was attempting to hide my embarrassment at being unable to control my crying baby when she turned around and walked back to her house. That night, I told Matt what our neighbor had said. He laughed, saying exactly what I had earlier. May sleeps through the night and hardly ever cries. That old lady is crazy, or probably missing her meds. I agreed and asked him to replace the baby monitors before changing the conversation. The next day, Matt installed the new baby monitors before he left to work. May and I stayed home for the rest of the day. We left one baby monitor in May's room, another one in the bedroom, and another one in the kitchen. I was upstairs cleaning our room, which was directly across the hall and 2 doors away from May's, when I began hearing the static again. I walked over to my nightstand and sat on my bed, attempting to make out the sound from the baby monitor. I didn't hear May crying, but instead I heard the same laughter I heard with the previous monitor. I walked over to May's room, carrying the monitor. Once again, she was sound asleep. May's monitor wasn't even playing anything. It stood on the dresser, silent. The lights didn't even turn on as I heard the laughter through the monitor I was carrying. Thinking it was strange, but not yet giving it to any paranormal explanation, I began walking downstairs to the kitchen when the sound suddenly stopped. I tried to shrug it off and continued cleaning, figuring that perhaps the area we live in made it easier to pick up sounds at a further distance. That night for dinner, I didn't tell Matt about the noise incident earlier that day. Matt seemed tired from work, and I didn't want to worry him with something that seemed like nonsense. A few nights after that, Matt and I were sleeping when I suddenly awoke. I was drenched in sweat and couldn't fall back to sleep. I decided to get up and go check on May. As I walked across the hall towards her room, I heard the static noise coming from downstairs. I stopped and pushed May's door open to make sure she wasn't awake. But sure enough, she was asleep, as always. The static was coming from the kitchen. I knew it was coming from the monitor. Being sleepy and tired, I became annoyed and decided to go downstairs and shut it off. I entered the kitchen and turned the lights on, reaching for the monitor on the counter. I turned the monitor around, looking for a button to shut it off, when I realized it was already off. I stood there dumbfounded and placed it back on the counter, walking away thinking that perhaps I had imagined it when I heard the static again. I turned around immediately. The lights on the monitor were on. I walked over, getting ready to throw the monitor across the room, when the sound stopped again. There's a large trash bin next to the counter. It was one of those ones you would step on in order to flip up the lid. As I stood there, staring down at the monitor, I caught a glimpse of a reflection on the trash bin. For a few seconds I saw what looked like a small child. A little girl reflected on the trash bin and directly behind me. I turned around terrified, expecting to see her. However, no one stood behind me. I looked around desperately, trying to find what had made the reflection, when the baby monitor in my hand had turned on again. The laughter was more clear. It was a child laughing and giggling. I dropped the monitor on the floor and darted upstairs towards May's room. More frightened than I had ever been in my entire life, I picked up May and took her to our bedroom. I woke up Matt, attempting to explain what I just heard. He woke up half asleep and went downstairs to check up on it. He came back upstairs a few minutes later, looking at me like I was crazy. He went back to bed and fell asleep immediately after. The next morning, May and I were out front on the porch, enjoying a beautiful day, when our neighbor came over. She looked worn out, nervous, and had black bags under her eyes. She wore pajamas, which were noticeably dirty. I greeted her, asking if she wanted any lemonade, before she interrupted me. She began saying how she hadn't been able to sleep well these past few days because of May's cries at night. I looked at her confused once again, and explained to her that May hadn't been crying at night. She started playing with her hands nervously and began saying that she could hear May screaming and crying every night. When she noticed I wasn't believing what she was telling me, her entire personality changed in an instant. She started yelling out profanity and telling me to, and I quote, "Take your little shit away from here and shut it the fuck up." Feeling threatened, I stood up and went over to May. While picking her up, I told the woman to leave. She stood there looking at May, angry and resentful. She kept yelling at us, startling May as she began to cry. I threatened her with calling the cops and kept telling her to leave before she finally decided to walk off. I went inside the house shaken up, and I felt upset that my neighbor would act in such a way where I felt threatened. I called Matt, asking him to leave work early, explaining what just happened. He immediately left the office and started heading home. As soon as he arrived home, I explained further what our neighbor had said. He became extremely upset. As he held May, we talked about what our neighbor had said regarding May's crying at night. He also didn't understand what our neighbor was talking about. May was a good baby. She hardly gave us any grief. As we were talking, we heard a knock on the door. Thinking that it was our next door neighbor again, Matt gave me May as he went to go see who was knocking. I let out a sigh of relief when our neighbor from across the street came in. Mr. Moss was one of the first friends we made when we moved here. Matt invited him to sit down and offered him something to drink. Mr. Moss politely declined, saying that he came over to talk to us about something very important. Matt and I sat down. I laid May on her swing, giving Mr. Moss my complete attention. He began explaining that earlier that morning, he had seen our next door neighbor come over and start screaming at me. He explained that for a few days now, our neighbor had been acting kinda strange, and he had noticed it when coming home from work. He mentioned that on one particular night, he pulled up to his house after working late, and he noticed her outside. She was standing outside in her pajamas on the side of the house while looking up at the window above her. When I asked him for details on the window she was looking up at, he explained that it was the one on the second floor in the right corner of the house. I looked at Matt nervously as Mr. Moss described May's window. Matt held my hands tightly. Mr. Moss went on to explain that after he pulled up to the driveway, he noticed that she wasn't moving. He found it curious that she didn't even look to see what car it was. Not wanting to spook her, in case she hadn't noticed him, he went inside his house to continue some work he still had left. He said that he was working on his laptop for a couple hours before deciding to go to sleep. As he was turning off the lights, he looked out the window, noticing that my neighbor was still standing there staring up. He started fidgeting on the sofa while he spoke to us, as if what he was saying scared him. What he said next frightened me to the point of tears. This time she wasn't standing alone, he said. He saw what seemed to be a little girl standing behind her, looking at her. He estimated the little girl was probably no more than 5 years old. She was wearing a dress and had long black hair. He mentioned that while looking outside his window, he gasped a little. And at that exact moment, the girl slowly turned away from my neighbor and turned her head towards him. He said at that moment he was scared and immediately closed his blinds and laid in bed too frightened to go to sleep. I asked him if he went up to go look again, to which he replied no. Matt and I thanked him as he left the house. We looked at each other deeply concerned about what he just shared. After a few hours of discussion about potentially getting the police involved, Matt got up to use the bathroom. I sat there completely lost in thought when I began hearing the baby monitor from the kitchen again. I stood up and ran to the kitchen. I stared at it while the familiar static slowly cleared to laughter. I picked up the monitor and ran towards the bathroom, pressing it firmly against the door, yelling at Matt to come out. He opened the door, asking what was wrong. When he stopped to hear the laughter playing on the monitor, I gave the baby monitor to him as we ran upstairs to May's room. We had put her to sleep upstairs after she passed out on her swing. We ran inside her room, nervous and scared. When we saw that she still lay there, sleeping in her crib, we looked at each other confused. The monitor he was holding suddenly went silent from the static. I stared at it before turning it around and shutting it off. We stood there in silence, attempting to rationalize what just happened, when the monitor in our bedroom turned on and began letting out that same laughter we just heard. The door was open, and the baby monitor stood on my nightstand. Matt and I could see it clearly from May's room. The laughter got louder and louder as it suddenly started playing on all three monitors. I picked up May, scared and crying at the same time. Matt held me as he dropped the monitor he was holding. The laughter went from child's laughter to something that sounded completely demonic. Right as we began running out of the room, the voice let out one last piercing scream. It screamed cry.
Cry.
As soon as it said that, we heard a gunshot that sounded like it came from next door. May woke up and began crying at the chaos in her room. Matt and I were getting ready to make a run for it when the laughter suddenly stopped. We ran out as fast as we could. Other neighbors started coming out of their homes, getting ready to investigate the gunshot. We bumped into Mr. Moss, waiting for the police to arrive, when two men decided to go inside our next-door neighbor's house to investigate. After a few minutes, one immediately came running out yelling, "We need an ambulance!" After about an hour of standing outside, Matt and I were still too afraid to go back inside for our car keys. We waited outside among all the police officers and Mr. Moss, hoping to overhear what had happened. A short, stubby lady that lived a few houses down came up to us explaining that she just overheard one of the men who had gone in to investigate. She said that the men found our next-door neighbor's body sitting in a chair, looking directly out the window with a gunshot wound in her head. I stood there stunned to hear that she decided to take her own life. When the lady continued speaking, she said that the gun was on the second floor and that she had cuts all over her arms, which seemed to be self-inflicted. She went on to explain, directly behind her on the wall, she had spelt out, "She won't stop crying," in her own blood. Matt and I left the majority of things at that house. We moved across the country and kept in contact with only Mr. Moss over the years. We wanted to leave everything behind us and start a new life with May. Nothing paranormal happened to us for years, and we were perfectly happy to move on. May is now 5 years old. She's a brilliant, curious, happy, and a loving child. Matt needed a few things from our storage this week and brought some old boxes home. This morning, May came into the kitchen, excited and attempting to get my attention as I was putting away the dishes. I had my back turned on her as she kept repeating, "Mama, girl, she's funny. Mama, she's laughing." I finally turned around, thinking that she was talking about her playdate next door, when I dropped the plate I was holding on the floor. The plate shattered on the floor, as did my heart when I saw what my little girl was holding up next to her ear. May was holding up one of the old baby monitors from the old house, and on it, I could hear a child's laughter.
Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. This story was narrated by the incredible talent that is Shivers. Be sure to go check out the other side of the collaboration over at his channel, as both stories are really creepy, which can be done by clicking the links on screen now. Go on. If you enjoyed this story, it would be great if you could let us know by leaving a like, comment or sharing this video with a friend.